talk about 4 critical elements in arm wrestling. Now, we've been talking about body positioning. We've been talking a lot of different specifics to get yourself in a position to maximize your chances of winning an arm wrestling match, okay? None of that's changing, okay? So with these 4 critical movements, remember, you still got to have perfect body position. You still got to bring your arm inside your body. You still got to maximize your leverage. You still got to stay tight. You still got to stay connected. You still got to understand your techniques. You still got to understand your counters. But when you're arm wrestling with somebody, there's 4 basic motions that I think are the most critical. We're going to cover those one by one. Okay, so the first one is radial flexion. Now, we talked about radial flexion before, okay, in the terminology section. That was your ability to bring your hand high, and that's, of course, with your opponent attached, okay? If Kevin's pulling back against me and I can't pull him, I can have your arm for a second. Okay, if he's pulling me this way, okay, and my wrist gets taken away, okay, and I can't get it back, my chances of winning the match are very, very slim, unless I get really, I put on some really crazy press or something, which is not going to happen, okay? So you have to be, I have to be, in this case, I have to be strong through here. So as he starts to pull me this way, I have to be able to stay tight through here, to be strong through here, and then be able to execute any number of techniques, but with my hand high, okay? So once this gets taken down, the body's really smart. The body goes, okay, the force is too great at the wrist. The wrist can't hold here. It goes, the body's not going to turn on all these other muscles full blast. It senses danger and it senses that you're going to get injured, so it's going to let that go. So he starts to pull this way, my wrist gets taken here. I can't produce maximum power with these muscles. They're halfway turned off. The body's like, I sense serious danger. I'm just going to let this go because your body's way smart. So he starts bringing me down, and I try to pull back against it because I can't produce any power. I can't retrieve this hand position, and I'm pinned and I'm pinned. You know, it's really important. So when it comes back to center, let's say we come back to center, we start the match all over again. If I'm strong through here, okay, and we're doing, let's say, that starting post position where we're both kind of set, we're going to produce a little back pressure. The ref says go. He pulls back this way. If I can match his strength, then I can start to produce different techniques on the table. If I can't match him right away and he can take my wrist, I'm in serious danger. There's no way I'm going to get really good arm wrestling with a weakness here. So that's number 1, is radial flexion. Some people also call it elevation, or I just call it keep your hand high, high hand, okay? Bringing your thumb towards your shoulder. That's all radial flexion. So we're going to use several terms for it, but that's what it is. Keep your hand high. That elevated hand position makes a huge part of arm wrestling. Okay, now number 2, okay, is hooking, flexion, wrist flexion. Okay, so adding radial flexion, this motion, to powerful motion here. So once again, if I'm not strong there, okay, and Kepa and I go to arm wrestle, and it's really common for all, I'm just going to say this early in the video, for all of you arm wrestlers, learn how to hook, because there's so many arm wrestlers out there that are going to put you into this position right here, where we're hooking. Now, my wrist flexors, my ability to bring my hand in this way, I'm very strong because I train these muscles really hard. Kepa's really strong there as well. Okay, so if I was really weak through here, I couldn't hold my hook. He would hook, and he'd be able to just break my position, steamroll through it, come up over it, okay, or just press, yeah, just drive right through the hand, okay? So your ability to be strong in your wrist flexors also lets you go on the offensive, okay? So Kepa and I are arm wrestling, same thing. We start center. If I'm trying to force a hook, okay, meaning I'm trying to say, I don't know this guy. I know he's strong. I can feel him pulling against me. I want to counter his movement. I go to hook him, okay? He's not just going to let me turn his wrist like that. He may have a granite wrist. He may have super strong wrist flexors. Okay, it's not that easy to do. Right, exactly. So he's resisting. Suddenly my hook's dead. Okay, so your ability to be strong in these elements, okay, is really important. Radial flexion, be strong there. Wrist flexion, be strong there. Okay, and we're going to get, in the end of the video, we're getting into a whole training, like a whole training camp of exercises that will get you the strongest in these vital body parts. But that's critical movement too. So radial flexion, wrist flexion, okay, those 2 things. Okay, the third thing, supination and pronation. Okay, some people call this rotation. So elevation, flexion, rotation. Okay, all those 3 things working together. Okay, like I said, this is pronation, like a top rolling movement. You're pouring the coffee pot, boom, pronation. Or supination, where you're actually turning the hand up. We could go into defensive top roll. If I can have your hand here for a second, Kepa. There are arm wrestlers out there that go into a defensive top roll on purpose. I don't suggest this, okay? But we'll actually shoot they'll just give up their hand and wrist and come into a position where he's got an offensive hook, they go right into a defensive hook, but they're so strong through their components, they're so strong in their hook, they'll just bleed the opponent out, wait for him to get tired, and then when he gets really tired, then they'll kind of go on the offensive. Okay, so being strong in your wrist flexors is super important, but that's also supination. Okay, so your ability to turn your hand this way, your ability to turn your hand this way are vitally important. If you're weak there, okay, if you're weak, let's say Kepa hooks me, okay, and this is interesting, okay, let's say he hooks me, bam, he starts to bring me down here, okay, my wrist is getting turned, what do you think I have to resist this movement? My bicep? No, okay, it's a little bit of bicep, but it's my pronator, okay, so if my pronator is weak, he's taking me this way, it's defensive too. So just as it's offensive, this is a strong pronator offensive, right? That's where it's coming in offensively. Okay, as he's hooking me into a deep hook, even though I'm supinated, interestingly enough, my pronator is being attacked. That's what's taking me over, and that's what my body's actually going to eventually give up. It's when there's too much attack here. It's not the pressure on my bicep. That would be more like pressure coming directly back this way. That would be more bicep pressure, okay? But that's really important. So your ability to be strong in those elements, your ability to be strong in pronation, and like I said, we'll get into a training video with all that, so don't worry about it now. Strong supination, strong pronation. They'll help you defend, they'll help you attack, okay? So one other thing. It's your elbow movement. We just talked about dragging, but elbow movement, whether that's offensively pressing forward or pulling back, okay? All of that dragging motion, so those four elements together, radial flexion, wrist flexion, okay? Supination and pronation, okay? And dragging, all those things working at once, okay, are totally vital to understanding. So not only do you need to be strong, that's number one, be strong in your radial flexors, be strong in your wrist flexors, be strong in your pronator and supinators, okay? And then be strong and be coordinated. I'll say be coordinated. Get experience in pulling with your lat muscle. By keeping everything tight here, dragging back. Like I said, you're still going to work. You can see those two components or three components are all working at once. I have radial flexion, wrist flexion, pronation, dragging. All four, you see that? It's like four motions all at once, but those are all critical. So hopefully that made sense. And we'll talk about training those groups specifically during the training section. Critical muscle groups. Now we just talked about critical elements, critical movements, and where to be strong. So this is going to tie in directly with that. Okay, so let's start from the tips of the fingers, and we'll just work this way. Okay, most important to least important in my opinion. So your fingers, obviously, your fingers are going to be stronger than you think. I'll say that because most people can hold themselves up even if they can't do a pull-up. Right? You can carry lots of groceries. Your fingers are actually working together. They're extraordinarily strong, even though they're fairly small. But I will say there's going to be limitations. When you go to an arm wrestling table, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story here. You ever shake hands with someone and they got like a concrete grip, like their hands just like, and they're not trying to break your hand, but you can tell they got these thick, strong hands. Whether they did construction for 30 years or whatever, you don't know, but they got these naturally really strong hands. Okay. Now, that's something, interestingly enough, is how it plays into arm wrestling. If I arm wrestle someone like that and we shake hands, we come to the start of the table, and I shake hands, I'm going to take a look at this guy. Just like that, okay? Now we're starting to get into strategy, okay? I'm going to take a look at the guy and look at his biceps. I'm going to look at his chest. I'm going to look at his wrist flexors, okay? And I'm going to feel his grip. I'm going to feel his hand, okay? That's all giving me information. If he's got some humongous bicep, that tells me, well, I shouldn't attack there. That's a bad idea. I shouldn't put him into a low hook and drive against his bicep, because especially if it's bigger than mine, okay? Same thing with wrist flexors. If he's got these humongous wrist flexors, it's probably, once again, it's probably a good idea to avoid a hook with someone that can outlast you and outburn you in a hook, even if you're really good at it, okay? If the muscles on the top of his forearms look maybe weak, that might be a place to attack, okay? The point is, a lot's going on even when you walk up to the tables. I'm looking at the person, seeing where they may be strong. That's going to give me a little information, especially if I've never seen them arm wrestle before. Okay, so fingers and hand, I'd say, is kind of number one muscle group. Okay, here's the interesting thing about fingers and hand. This is why hooks and presses and everything else came up, because not everyone is strong in the same areas. Some guys are going to be super strong, and they're going to have these humongous hands and these thick tree trunk type banana-sized fingers, and they'll just be able to rip through your hand if that's where you arm wrestle them, if that's what you're trying to pull. if you fight a losing battle against someone in the same, if you're trying to do the same technique to them they're doing to you and they're ripping through your fingers, okay, that's not the way to arm wrestle. Okay, and we're going to get a lot deeper into that kind of thinking. Okay, but as far as fingers and hands go, I don't do a lot of training for my own fingers and hands. I did for a while, and this was kind of the story I wanted to tell. Is I got those grippers. They have like the Kings of Crush grippers. I mean, I never got very high on those because my fingers were so sore, and I started getting like nerve tingling and stuff like that. But either way, I realized after arm wrestling competitively, I realized I don't ever need to get as strong as my competitors in their hands and fingers. I realized some of the guys I was going against, like those guys with the concrete grip, when I was going against those guys, I realized no matter how many crunches I do, no matter how much I eat, no matter how much weights I lift, my fingers and hands are never going to be as big or strong as those guys are. So I realized I'm not going to like just let them go. I'm going to keep training them to a certain degree, but I started to work on techniques where I didn't have to deal with their hand and their fingers, okay? And this is starting to get into more complex arm wrestling. So if I could have Keppa's on here for a second, this is what I mean. Okay, so he's got huge hands and fingers. Let's say he's one of those guys with the concrete grip. He's going to do all of his, and I've seen him arm wrestle, he's going to pull through your hands and fingers. He's going to attack my fingers because he's got huge hands and fingers. He's going to attack my hand by peeling it back. He's going to go through my fingers, and that's where he's going to attack. That's going to fold my wrist back. I'm going to lose the match if I arm wrestle him that way. Now, we talked about that low hook before, okay? I would, with a person like that who's got really strong hands and fingers, I mentioned this before, take a lower hand position, even if that's just a little lower. It doesn't need to be way down below the wrist, okay? Just a little bit lower, okay? And it would nullify his technique. So instead of dealing with his top roll, I would focus on quickly forcing him into that hook, where suddenly his hands and fingers don't make any difference at all. Now all the pressure's here, right? Rotation, it's all against the wrist flexors and it's against the bicep. So suddenly I'm attacking a totally different part of the body. So this is going to get you into kind of a fundamental understanding of muscle groups. Okay, so number 2 is your wrist and your forearms. Okay, wrist and forearms. And we just covered hand and fingers. Okay, obviously you want to keep them strong, keep them conditioned. We're going to go into that training later, but you don't necessarily need to go crazy in there. If you're a guy who's already really strong in the hands and fingers, continue being strong there and develop techniques that are going to let you attack where you're strongest, okay? And this is, like I said, this is getting into a little more complex arm wrestling. That's what this section's all about. Okay, so wrist and forearms. We talked about wrist flexion. We talked about extension. Now, we talked about that kickback being the counter to a hook, okay? My muscles, my wrist extensors, okay, and my wrist flexors, extension, flexion, okay? Those muscles need to be strong. They need to be conditioned. Anytime, I can honestly say this, I have never done an arm wrestling tournament where I didn't get in a hook match at least one time. You know, generally speaking, I would try to initiate hooks, but even when I didn't, someone would quickly hook you, and suddenly you're having to put pressure on all those muscles. So whether you're going to win a tournament or not, it's going to come down at some point to whether you have strong wrist flexors, and the same thing for your extensors. You need to be strong through the wrist. We already talked about being strong through here. Okay, this elevation position, right? Same thing. This is still wrist strength. I mean, even though it's the muscles on the forearms, that's why I say wrist and forearms, because the muscles are here, they're shortening, pulling up your wrist. Same thing goes for flexion, okay? If you're weak through here, it's this motion too, okay? You need to be strong through here. You need to have wrist stability too. So if your wrist is just easily peeled back, that's not going to work very well in arm wrestling. You need to be strong through here. You need to be able to impose your will with your wrist, or at least be able to stay stable without it getting taken here, without it getting taken here, without it getting taken folded back. So that's like number 2. Critical muscles, work the muscles of the forearm, work the muscles of, okay, the inside, the wrist flexors, work the wrist extensors, okay. Now, upper arms, so bicep, tricep. Now, couple of our arm wrestle again. Now, interestingly enough, different muscles can be put under maximum tension within an instant. I mean, so I could go from putting all the pressure here, which he feels, right, to coming in, and suddenly all the pressure is against the bicep, okay? So depending on where the other person's attacking, you may need a whole host of different strong muscle groups, and that's why I wanted to cover these kind of critical muscle groups, because you've got to stay strong in the positions you're going to be using in arm wrestling, whether that's offensive or defensive, okay? The bicep is super important, okay? So he starts to bring me over. Let's say I end up in that defensive hook position, okay? We talked about that a few times. But we go into that, okay, if I'm holding here and he's driving this way, I got to stay strong in my pronator, okay, but my bicep is dealing with most of the real stress, okay, so my ability to break that hook, okay, or my ability to actually go on the attack and start to pull is going to come down to how strong my bicep is, whether defensively or offensively. Offensively, one of the things, I work really hard on my biceps, okay, because I always, during a match, I end up getting into some position where almost all the tension is against my biceps. And by being strong, I'm able to win the match. By being really weak through here, it's just not going to cut it. The tension is going to go against that from one angle or another, whether it's straight away, whether it's in a rotational. The biceps got to be strong. So you got to condition it from several angles. Like I said, we'll cover that at the end. And then the fourth thing, well, actually, let me cover triceps first too. And this is a little more complicated. For triceps, you have to stay really strong through the triceps more for stability purposes than power production purposes. And this is what I mean. So Kep and I are here. Let's say I was going to do, I've heard people in arm wrestling talk about the tricep press. Okay? Yeah, there are a host of guys out there that can just press with just their tricep, okay? Not driving with the elbow, okay? Just their tricep, okay? I found that to be extraordinarily bad for the elbow, okay? You want to talk about elbow pain? Try driving someone in an arm wrestling match with just your tricep. That's not natural at all, okay? There's not really any strength there. That doesn't mean you can't win that match, but you may never arm wrestle for, you might not arm wrestle for 2 months or 3 months after that, okay? So this is what I mean for the tricep. Tricep should be strong. We're going to build them from several different angles, but it's more to stabilize the joint, okay? The bicep stabilizing from this end. The only other thing you got are the 3 tricep muscles back here stabilizing the pressure from the other side. So even though you're not using it in a more offensive manner, meaning the tricep's not like actively, as fun as that would be, even if you had strong tricep, it doesn't work that way, okay? He's pulling back with his entire body, okay? And I try to just use my tricep. It's never going to work. It's never going to work, okay? So by being stable through here, by just being strong enough to maintain my position, okay, you can drive the elbow forward on the pad from several different angles, and even though it appears to be like a tricep press, it's really not. It's more like driving with the shoulders staying strong through the tricep. So be careful about that in terms of tricep. Be careful about trying to press with just the arm, okay? And so the fourth component I want to talk about is kind of your shoulders and your lats. And I'll talk about the shoulders first. So with the shoulders, obviously, if Kep and I are arm wrestling, if you're producing power in a pressing type motion, whether that's at an angle here or whether that's even directly towards him, okay? The shoulder's playing a big part in that. It's just like you're doing a bench press. You're pressing away. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm pressing. That power's got to come from somewhere, right? It's shoulder along with my whole body driving with my legs. I'm driving with my legs, kind of putting my body behind the hand and then driving. But the shoulder's playing a huge part. The other part the shoulder plays is, have you ever done a lift like this where you take a dumbbell and you just kind of lift it like this? Okay? That's one of the ones I'm going to show you in the training session, but the point is this, okay? If Kep and I are arm wrestling, okay, I can produce force towards, not a ton, but I can produce force towards my body with my shoulder too. So I can press, you feel that there? Yeah. Right? Then it starts to pull you off balance a little bit, right? It starts to pull him away from the pad. I can do that, okay? And he's going to focus on trying to stay down, and then once the go goes, I can go kind of in a totally separate direction, okay? But the shoulders play a big part. Another thing is obviously your stability on the table. So as he's wrenching this way, okay, that's a lot of shoulder. The rotator cuffs are working too. So your ability to internally rotate, you know how we talked about pulling your arm in, internal rotation, okay? And then stabilizing that position? That's a lot to do with your rotator cuffs, okay? The 4 rotator cuff muscles that are surrounding the shoulders. So your shoulders are playing a big part. Even though they're not actively doing a lot of the force production, generally speaking, they're mostly stabilizing the whole body position. So super important. The last one I wanted to talk about, in terms of muscle groups that I feel like are super important, because the core is obviously important, the legs are important, but in terms of real critical elements, I'd say the lat muscles. Your lat muscles, you have to be able to coordinate motion, pulling with your lat, not pulling with your arm. Okay, your lat, like the muscle you use for the most part doing like pull downs or doing pull-ups, okay? Especially neutral grip pull-ups, which we're going to get into the training section. That's a huge part of arm wrestling. Okay, internal rotation. Your lats, okay, are one of the keys to holding your arms in close to your body, okay? And by far. by far your most important muscle group for being able to drive your elbow back. Like, have you ever done a low row, a seated row, like an exercise where you're pulling the weight this way? Okay, that's your lats working. Obviously, your biceps and forearms and stuff need to do a little bit of the work, but especially for arm wrestling, if you can do it where, if I get on for a second, if you can get to the point where you can generate a majority of the force with just your lat, meaning you're coordinated enough to do it and you're experienced enough to, on the table, if you've practiced enough to where you're getting really efficient at pulling with your lat muscle, not pulling with the bicep, not pulling with the forearm. You're stabilizing here, you're stabilizing here, you're actually pulling with that lat muscle, okay? The more you can do that, the more arm wrestling matches you're going to win. About the styles of arm wrestling. That's just a word that I think says it best. I'd say there's 3 different styles of arm wrestling, and I want you to understand there's a whole bunch of techniques to arm wrestling. Okay, the hooks, the top rolls, the pressing, and all the different actual physical techniques. That's not what I'm talking about when it comes down to arm wrestling styles. Okay, so for arm wrestling styles, I like to think about there being 3: attacking, counter-attacking, and defensive. Okay, you can be an attacking arm wrestler, a counter-attacking arm wrestler, or a defensive arm wrestler. And I want to make this perfectly clear. Some arm wrestlers, for the most part, they just do one or the other. You don't need to be like that. Your arm wrestling style can change from match to match. Okay, opponent to opponent. You can attack one person, counter-attack the next, depending on how much knowledge you have. And that's of course what this section is about. Okay, but think of those as the 3 different styles. And I'm going to break them down. Kind of one at a time. So we're going to do attacking in this one, counter-attacking in the next one, and then defensive. Okay, so in terms of attacking, just think of it this way. Okay, for the most part, this is the best strategy to go in. If you don't know your opponent, if I don't know who this guy is, okay, I'm going to have to attack him. There's no counter to what I don't know is coming. Most people, and this even goes for world-class arm wrestlers, most people, if they don't know what the arm wrestler is going to do, especially if the person's already pretty good, people can really camouflage the technique they're going to use, especially the whole host of techniques that they can use, okay? So, without going on and on, if you go up against an arm wrestler that you don't know, and you have no idea, you've never seen an arm wrestler, like if you get to see a guy 3 or 4 times in a tournament, and then you get to take him on, you usually get a pretty clear indication of what he's probably going to do, even for the first match and then the second match. Guys get into a trend, and they just do the same thing over and over, and they think no one's noticing. You know why? Because most people aren't. Most people aren't paying attention to that. If you are paying attention, it can give you a lethal advantage. Okay? So, the point is this. For attacking, okay, if you don't know your arm wrestler, you don't know what technique he's going to do, then the best thing you can do is go on the attack. And that means, as quickly as possible, you're going to try to force your opponent into a position that you can win at. Okay? So I don't mean attack with some technique that's not going to be your strongest technique. You got to develop those real attack style power techniques where you're like, if I can get this guy in this position and start to go back, he's going to have to be really, really strong in order to withstand that. Okay, that's generally what I speak about attacking. So I'll show you my attack move while we're doing it. I have several, but okay. So attacking. Okay, where I feel like I'm strongest, and I believe I'm right. Where I feel like I'm strongest is in a deep hook. Okay, with back pressure. And then level dropping, okay? And I'm just going to show you that. It doesn't really matter, but this is what I consider my strongest attack position, okay? Regardless of anything he's going to bring, okay? I'm going to try to force this hook, okay? I'm going to drive my elbow to the back of the pad, okay? Keeping that wrist just this way, so his bicep is attacked, his wrist is attacked, and all I got to do is sit down on the floor, okay? And I'm not producing any more pressure, okay? But in terms of attack, if I was going to attack an arm wrestler, I'd go bam, and really quickly try to drive all that pressure against him. I know for a fact he would have to be really strong in his wrist components, his wrist flexor, his pronator, and his biceps. So I'd be attacking almost everything at once. Okay, does that make sense? And level changing in order to maximize pressure. So in terms of attacking, that's what I mean. Attack with your strongest technique, what you feel is probably going to give you the very, very best chance of winning. And we're going to cover counterattack next. Okay, now style number 2 2, counter-attacking. So we talked about attacking, where you don't know your opponent. Now, if you do know your opponent and you know what arm wrestling technique is going to do, a counter-attacking style is much, much, much more beneficial. Okay? Now, we've talked about counters a little bit. We're going to get really into depth on those a little bit later. But in terms of a counter-attacking style, that's all that means, is you're countering the opponent's motion from the get-go, from the start. Okay, now there's several ways of countering during the match, but that's arm wrestling, okay? There's always going to be countering during a match. That's not what I'm talking about. Counter-attacking style is where from the very get-go, from the first second of the go, you're countering. You're not trying to force your will on your opponent. You're trying to do the opposite of what he's going to do to you in order to put him in the worst possible position. I'll show you an example. This very strong counter, we've already done it a couple times, I'll show you one more time, would be a counter to a hook. Especially if he's coming towards me to get his hook, if he's kind of driving in, because that's an interesting way of setting a hook, and we'll talk about setting hooks later too, is instead of him actually twisting my wrist, if he just drives forward, he can almost come around. He just drives forward, that way he doesn't have to press my wrist, he can just come around and turn his wrist, and suddenly I'm turned with him, okay? So, point is this. If I know that's what he's going to do, he's going to come forward, he's going to hook, okay? My move, instead of hooking with him, which would just be we'd get into a hook match and we'd suddenly be we'd have a battle and one of us would win. But if he's already shooting for a hook, generally the guys that shoot for a hook in big time arm wrestling or any arm wrestling, they're good at it, okay? They're strong. You don't want to go where your opponent's strong, okay? And we'll get into that. So as far as the counter, this is a counter-attacking style. If I know he's coming towards me to hook, even if he had his elbow back here, and some people even drive forward like that, okay? If he's going to drive forward and get the hook, my counter would be this, okay? So as he does it with a slow motion, boom. I would turn my wrist into hook, but I come into a post position, okay? Suddenly, his hook has turned his hand upside down. I would do the same thing, change levels, drop, and bring his hand down. So that's a counter-attacking style, as opposed to attacking, where you just try to force your opponent into a position and pull them down. Counter-attacking is I'm very specifically doing the exact opposite motion. So that's kind of like winning the match before it starts. It's basically like winning the match before it starts. You're considering everything before you even get to the table, and the table is just a matter of fact. By the time you get up there, he goes for the same move he knew he was going to do, and you put him into a bad position and win the match. So that's counter-attacking, and then we'll cover defensive next. Okay, so the third style of arm wrestling I wanted to talk about, in addition to attacking, counter-attacking, there's also defensive arm wrestling. Okay, and there's several different ways to do that. Now, Kep and I, if we were arm wrestling, now if I was to be a defensive arm wrestler, okay, let's say even if I don't know what he's going to do, okay, I'm just going to shoot for a defensive position. Okay, now a defensive hook is just a nice basic example. Okay, so on the go, I wouldn't focus on getting him to the pad. I wouldn't focus on beating him at all, actually. I wouldn't focus on any type of winning from the get-go. Defensive arm wrestling, you're just focusing on stopping the match. That's it. Okay? Counter-attacking, you're focusing on getting your opponent from the get-go. With attacking, you're focusing on speed and trying to force him into a bad position, win the match quickly as possible. Okay? Defensive, not that way at all. Defensive arm wrestling, let's say I shot for that defensive hook. We start to arm wrestle. I go into a defensive hook. Now, if I'm really strong in these components, and I am, I could generally hold someone who wasn't quite as strong in those components, let's say. Okay, so if I know that's the case, I can shoot for a defensive position. It might be a safe bet in an arm wrestling match. If you don't know what they're going to do, you shoot for a defensive position where you know you're really strong, okay, and you hold it, basically. You bleed the opponent. We're going to talk about bleeding the opponent. So let's say I put him into that. Of course, once I get in there, he's got to try to get me down. Okay, he's got me in a bad spot. He's going to focus all his energy and everything. If I can hold him through that period, 10 seconds or 15 seconds, if I can kind of wear him down, then as the match goes on, I can slowly turn that hook, okay, and then bring it into an offensive hook and win the match. But that's the idea with defensive arm wrestling. Actually shooting for a position where your whole goal is just to hold the opponent for as long as possible, bleed them out, and then win the match. So that's defensive arm wrestling style. I'm going to give you one more example right after this. Okay, so one other thing for defensive style arm wrestling, the strap plays a huge role, and I didn't want to skip over that. The strap plays a huge role for defensive arm wrestlers. That doesn't mean you can't attack and counterattack in the strap. It has nothing to do with it. But for defensive purposes, It's going to produce forces, and it's going to allow you to hold different positions a lot better than you could without the strap. And of course, once you start getting into arm wrestling and using it, you're going to know exactly what I mean. But here's an example. Michael Todd, famous world-class arm wrestler. Okay, he's known for defensive arm wrestling. Okay, what he does nowadays is he just produces back pressure. That's it. Okay, and rotation. So what he's going to do is on go, this is defensive style. This is exactly defensive style. He gets himself into the strap. He's going to slip out on the first match. Second match is going to get into the strap. Very much on purpose, okay? On the go, he drives back, and then he does a transition, okay? Where he's going to just drive back and allow his arm to be as pronated as possible. And this is a trap, okay? So Kepa, side pressure, whatever. He comes this way hard as he can. If I come down here, right, as I'm coming up, like Michael Todd does, he puts a ton of force against the wrist and can keep the opponent from actually coming down. So he's one of the few guys that can actually do it. But that's a really good example of defensive arm wrestling with bleeding and trapping. So I'm trapping him into a position where I'm giving the arm up. I'm not trying in any way on the go to bring him this way at all. I'm letting him take my hand. Okay, and then I'm just focused on, I'm kind of doing a little pull and I'm transitioning away, okay, defensive top roll, and that's what allows you to kind of bend the wrist back. It's a complicated technique, but Michael Todd's become a real pro at it. That's defensive arm wrestling.